They buried their father on a Saturday morning in October. The weather was gray. The church was full. 3 adult children stood at the graveside in black coats and held each other, because grief does not ask whether or not a family is complicated before it arrives. It simply arrives. After the burial, they drove to the notary's office. Because their father had been organized always about matters of property and money. He had made a will. They knew about the will. They had known about it for years. What they did not know, what none of them could have prepared for, was that the will they were about to hear read was not the will their father had made 10 years ago. It was a new will, signed 48 hours before he died. And when the notary finished reading it, 2 of the 3 children in that room had been left almost nothing. The third, the youngest, the one who had moved back into the family home in the last year of their father's illness to care for him, had been left everything. Today, we're going to talk about one of the most ancient and most devastating forms of family betrayal that exists. A betrayal that happens not in anger, not in a moment of passion, but in the cold and deliberate silence of a dying man who chose, with the last organized act of his life, to reach from beyond the grave and rearrange the world his children would wake up in. Dark psychology calls this post-mortem control, and what it reveals about the human need for power and what it does to the people left behind is something that will stay with you long after this video ends. The father's name was Henri. He was 78 years old when he died of a progressive lung condition in a hospital in Toulouse. He had 3 children from his first marriage, Alain, 54, Céline, 51, and Marc, 47. His first wife, their mother, had died 12 years earlier. He had remarried briefly, divorced, and spent the last decade of his life alone, or so his 2 older children believed. What Alain and Céline did not fully understand, what they had not wanted to examine too closely, was the relationship that had developed between their father and Marc in the final years of Henri's life. Marc had always been different in the family, quieter, more present, the one who called every Sunday, the one who showed up when something broke, when something needed fixing, when Henri could no longer drive himself to appointments. When Henri's illness progressed and a decision needed to be made about care, it was Marc who suggested moving in. It was Marc who organized the medication schedules, the home nurse visits, the hospital trips. Alain and Céline visited when they could. They had their own lives, their own children, their own pressures, their own complicated feelings about a father who had not always been easy to love. They told themselves that Marc's proximity was practical, that it made sense for the youngest to be closest, that they were grateful. They did not ask themselves what that gratitude was costing everyone. Henri died on a Wednesday. The new will had been signed on the preceding Monday, 2 days before his death, when he was already in the final stage of his illness, already receiving continuous pain management, already, according to the hospital records, intermittently confused. The notary who witnessed the signing stated that Henri had appeared lucid at the time of signing, that he had expressed clearly what he wanted, that he had not been coerced. Alain and Céline did not believe this. They contested the will. The legal process took 2 years and cost more than the contested inheritance was worth. In the end, the courts upheld the will. But long before the courts delivered their verdict, something else had already been decided. The 3 children of Henri, who had stood together at that graveside, who had held each other in the gray October morning, because grief had not asked whether or not they were complicated, had become strangers to each other. Now I want to stop and do something that this story makes very difficult. I want to look at it from all 3 sides, because dark psychology does not allow us the comfort of a simple villain. And Henri's story, like all of the stories we tell on this channel, is more complicated than it first appears. From Alain and Céline's perspective, the new will was a betrayal. Their father had made promises, not legally binding ones, but the kind of promises that families make across kitchen tables and in quiet conversations about what will happen when. They had spent their entire childhoods in a family that presented itself as equal. They had believed, without ever needing to verify it, that they were equally loved. The will said otherwise. The will said, I saw you. I watched you build your lives elsewhere. I watched Marc stay, and in the end, I chose the one who stayed. From Marc's perspective, and this is the part of the story that almost never gets told, the inheritance was not a gift. It was the conclusion of a transaction that had lasted 3 years. 3 years of being present while his siblings were absent. 3 years of managing medication schedules and hospital corridors, and a father who was frightened and in pain, and sometimes cruel in the way that frightened, dying people can be. 3 years of watching his own life shrink around the edges because someone had to be there, and he was the one who could not find a reason not to be. Did Marc know about the new will? Alain believed yes. Céline was less certain. The truth, according to people who knew the family, was somewhere in between. Marc had not orchestrated it, but he had not discouraged it either. He had been present in the room when Henri spoke about fairness and sacrifice. He had not left the room. Dark psychology identifies what Henri did in the last 48 hours of his life as an act of posthumous control, and it is far more common than most people realize. Posthumous control is the use of inheritance, property, or legally binding final documents as instruments of power, punishment, or reward, exercised at a moment when the person being controlled has no opportunity to respond, negotiate, or even understand what has happened until it is already irreversible. It is the ultimate expression of what psychologists call the need for final authority, the deep human drive, particularly strong in certain personality types, to determine the narrative of one's own life and legacy, even after the body can no longer enforce it. The will becomes the last word. And the last word, in families like Henri's, is almost never about money. It is about meaning. It is about the final settling of a lifetime of scores that were never openly discussed. It is the answer to questions that were never directly asked. Who loved me most? Who sacrificed most? Who deserved me? Who disappointed me? Delivered at a moment when the person delivering the answer cannot be challenged, cannot be asked to explain, cannot be held to account. Henri had been, by most accounts, a complicated man. Not cruel in obvious ways, not absent in obvious ways, but the kind of father whose approval moved like weather, unpredictable, ungovernable, and capable of sudden cold. His children had spent their childhoods reading the sky of him, trying to position themselves correctly in relation to something they could not control. Alain had become successful and distant, the eldest solution. Build a life so large and so full that the approval of one difficult man becomes a small thing inside it. Céline had become the peacemaker, forever moderating, forever translating, forever trying to create a version of the family that worked. Marc had become indispensable, the youngest solution, and perhaps the most dangerous one, because indispensable people are never quite free. What dark psychology sees in this family is not a villain and two victims. It sees a system built across decades by one man's particular way of distributing love, unevenly, conditionally, always with the implicit suggestion that there was only so much of it available and that it had to be earned. Each child responded to that system differently. And Henri's final act was the system's logical conclusion, the last redistribution of the only currency that had ever really mattered in that family. Not money. Proof. Alain and Céline spent 2 years in a legal battle that cost them not just money, but the last remnants of a family. Every court document was also an accusation. Every deposition was also a conversation they had never been able to have while their father was alive. Every lawyer's letter was also the letter they had wanted to write to Henri himself, saying, "Why were we not enough? Why did you leave us like this? Why, after everything, did you use the last coherent act of your life to tell us we had failed?" The courts did not answer those questions. Courts do not answer those questions. They rule on validity and capacity and undue influence. They do not rule on love. Marc did not speak to Alain or Céline for 3 years after the will was upheld. When contact finally resumed, it was Céline who reached out, not to reconcile, but because their mother's grave needed tending and someone had to organize it, and there was no one left but the 3 of them. She said later that the phone call was the strangest conversation of her life, because they talked about the grave, about the headstone, about whether to plant something or leave it as it was, and they did not talk about any of it. They spoke in the practical language of adult siblings managing a shared responsibility, and underneath every word was everything that had not been said for 3 years and might never be said at all. Dark psychology leaves us here.